1, and we finally got there last week. And so let's look at those first couple of verses again. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. We noticed then, after Nebuchadnezzar's defeat of the Assyrians and the Egyptians in 609 at Carchemish, he then begins to exert his influence and will over this area of the world. And, of course, Daniel here calls him king. Technically, at the time, of course, he first comes to Jerusalem in around 605 BC. He is a co-regent with his father Nabopolassar, and so king would be accurate, although Daniel could be speaking proleptically. In other words, it would be the same thing if I said President Donald J. Trump won the 50-yard dash in high school. Well, he wasn't president when he was in high school, but we refer to him as president because he is at this moment in time, and so certainly that's the way that Daniel may have been using that term. But certainly up until this point, the Egyptians were the ones who held sway over Jehoiakim. But at this point, then Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and there's no battle here. It's just a, pretty much Jehoiakim and the rest of the nation acknowledges Nebuchadnezzar's supremacy and his right to rule over this land. And notice that phrase again that I mentioned to you as we left last week. Please notice how many times in this first chapter, and this first chapter sets the tone for the book, that the text says that the Lord gave. It doesn't say Nebuchadnezzar took. It says the Lord gave. And so Judah's defeat is not attributable to Nebuchadnezzar's military or to his strength, but the providential operation of God. And frankly, it's because of the Israelites' continual unfaithfulness to the Mosaic covenant across several generations, many generations, and their rejection of the prophets, of course, that God sent to them. And Daniel addresses God by this term Adonai, emphasizing his lordship over the earth, over his right to rule over nations and his supremacy. And, without the affirmation here of God's sovereignty, people might think the average Jew who was an idolater during this time, that's the reason they're going into captivity, and to the average Babylonian and to Nebuchadnezzar himself, it would appear then to them on the surface that the Babylonian gods, and probably more specifically Marduk, their chief god, was more powerful than the God of heaven. But the Bible assures us that's not the reason that Nebuchadnezzar gains Jerusalem or Judah. He gets it because God gave it to him, and God gives it to him. As we mentioned last week and as we ended, God has removed, according to Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, God has removed that hedge that he had put around his people because of their unfaithfulness. And in fact, it not only shows that it shows God's providence, and it's not only the fact that these gods are not more powerful than him because they're not gods at all, but actually it points out God's faithfulness, does it not? Because why? How does it point to God's faithfulness? The fact that he gives his people into the hands of this foreign enemy, how does that prove his faithfulness? He told him he would. He always keeps his word. And he says something, he's going to keep it. And so he says, look, if you don't keep this covenant, this is what's going to happen to you. He'd go all the way back to Deuteronomy, he told them that. And then he's warned them through all these prophets what's going to happen. And he's just keeping his word. And so really it points up to God's faithfulness. And so Jehoiakim promptly surrenders. And there's really no indication in the scriptures or in the Babylonian chronicles of any serious damage inflicted upon the city. But he does do some things. What does he do? He takes some of the articles of the house of God. Now, why would he do that? Why would he do that? Absolutely. To him, his God, he's got to bring a present to his God. And so what better present than to take vessels from the house of the God that you have defeated, supposedly, and take them to the house of your God. Now, this is a situation, I think I like what Brother McGuigan said in his commentary. This is a tiger by the tail situation. Kind of like you recall back when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. You remember what happened to them for several months when they took it back to their land? Yeah, they had all kinds of problems. And we're going to see these very vessels, which Nebuchadnezzar takes prisoner into the house of his God, we're going to see them again in chapter 5. And because of Belshazzar's disrespect for the God of heaven, we'll see what happens to him. But I think it also points out here too, and you're going to see this throughout this book, Nebuchadnezzar is an interesting guy, and we're going to talk about this some more, but for one thing about his character, he's a religious man. And people back then generally were. Now, they weren't worshiping the one true and living God, but he is a religious person. And he certainly believes in his own God. And we're told he carries them back to the land of Shinar. Why is that significant? Where is the land of Shinar? Now, it gives us some geographical information, but perhaps it tells us a little more than that. What happened in the plain of Shinar way back in Genesis? The Tower of Babel, a brazen monument to man's rebellion. Here, Nebuchadnezzar is taking these vessels back to the land of Shinar, the very epitome of rebellion against God. And so Nebuchadnezzar is going to loot the vessels of the temple 3 times, really. He takes some here in 605. He takes some more in 597. And then, of course, he finally strips the temple and destroys the city in 586. But if you go to Jeremiah 27, about verses 8 through 12, it confirms the fact he didn't take them all on this first trip. And again, this God that's referred to into the land of the house of his God is most likely Bel, or also known as Marduk, the apex of the Babylonian pantheon. He's kind of like Zeus or Jupiter. Supposedly, Nebuchadnezzar built a major structure to Marduk that towered 300 feet over the city of Babylon, and it had images containing almost or close to 50,000 pounds of gold. So he took his worship of Marduk very seriously. So, 2 major themes of the book of Daniel are established in this verse 2. First, the authority and the sovereignty of God over the earth, its nations, its kings, its people. God gave, the Lord gave. And I think sometimes we just don't think about this enough, that He is the God over human history, and it unfolds at His direction. And that's what the book of Daniel is about. I like what one commentator says: the Creator who loosed the arrow of time remains in control of its flight. The point is, history is not haphazard. I mean, it's going somewhere. Most people in this world think it's just haphazard. You know, the universe is here by accident. We're here by accident. This is all just, everything's chance. And, you know, we're arrogant enough to think that we can save the earth, we can save the environment, as if we can destroy it to begin with. But that's not the way history is. And that's what Daniel's about. These 4 empires, they come about because of God's purpose. And we have to understand, just like when we talked about the nature of God before, that when you're an eternal being and you're not time-bound, I mean, He's from everlasting to everlasting. The reason He can see down here is because He's already down here, you see. He's not just over here where we are. He spans all dimensions at one time. So to Him, it's all in the present. He says, I am that I am. He lives in the present. Everything that happens is in the present for Him. And so therefore, He is in control. And sometimes we forget that as Christians. We fret and we worry and we wring our hands about current things that are going on, forgetting who's in control. And so whether you're in the hands even of a foreign king, you get taken prisoner and taken off somewhere, you're still under God's control. You're still within His hand. That's theme number one, God's sovereignty and authority over the earth and history. Commentator number two, Edward Young, wrote that here the phrase house of God, he says he took some of the articles of the house of God, can literally be translated the house of the God. And so the point being, from this point forward, Daniel is proclaiming the existence of only one true and living God. And therefore, Jews, you polytheistic Jews, you that had committed adultery against your God and were worshiping all these other idols, there's only one God. And by the way, Babylonians, your religion is built upon lies as well. One God, and He is in control. And so Nebuchadnezzar takes these vessels, but only because God allows it and gives them to him. And again, it's not a mark of God's impotency, but His faithfulness to His own covenant. So then what does Nebuchadnezzar do? Let's read verses 3 through 7. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. He takes some hostages, and this was, of course, very common during that time, to take political prisoners. Children as political prisoners would encourage what on the part of the parents? Yeah, absolutely, cooperation. You recall when we were talking about Antiochus Epiphanes IV, which we'll read about later in the book, that he was actually a political prisoner of the Romans for 12 years while his father was king of the Syrians. And they made his dad pay tribute for those 12 years before they let him go. So this was not uncommon. Plato wrote that the Persians began the formal education of their nobility at the age of 14. Xenophon stated that this continued some 3 years until the age of 16 or 17, so a pretty rigorous program. So probably these boys are in their early teens. Most commentators suggest maybe 14, 15 years old. What would be the advantage of that, starting at that age? Yeah, number one, first of all, they have to be old enough to demonstrate some potential. Okay? Remember, look at some of the qualifications here. You know, you got to be good looking, physically attractive. But you also have to be smart, gifted, able to learn all this stuff they're going to teach you. So you got to demonstrate some potential. So you got to be able to be old enough for them to make this assessment. But number two, you got to be young enough for them to mold and re-educate you. And what's that do? What does this do for Nebuchadnezzar? What does this do for any conquering nation when they take the best from this nation and incorporate them into their culture and use them for their purpose? What does that do? Strengthens one, weakens the other, right? Nebuchadnezzar's empire was expanding rapidly, and so he was needing, of course, men of ability and talent to administrate that empire. And frankly, he could use some of the same people that he took captive to administrate the places that he conquered. He's not stupid. The Hebrew word translated eunuch, S-A-R-I-S, can refer to either a castrated male or any court official. For instance, the term is applied to Potiphar, who was, of course, a married man in Genesis chapter 39. I suspect, and if you read most commentators, the reason it started referring to court officials, however, is because of the prominence and importance that eunuchs took on over the years. At first, these male captives were castrated so that they could do what? Why castrate them? Well, who are they going to be around? The king's harem. And the king doesn't want these guys messing with his harem. If you're going to be guarding my harem, then, I got to be pretty confident about what you're going to be up to. So, castrate them. But after a while, over the years, they became pretty important. They became learned, and so they were actually, court officials as well. If you'll recall, when Jehu entered the city, and Jezebel, he came into the city and he yelled, "Who's for me?" And it said some eunuchs stuck their head out the window. And what did he tell them to do? Throw her down. So the question becomes among commentators, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah actually castrated or not? And there's a split of opinion on that. I think probably because we don't like to think about that, frankly. I think it's hard for a Bible commentator to read this and say, I don't want to think about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah being castrated. I mean, nobody wants to think about that. That's terrible. These guys are not only taken captive into another land, and then they're castrated. But let me tell you something. Life was hard for nations that were defeated by these people. We don't really understand that. And so a lot of commentators, we don't know for sure. We can't tell. Well, maybe we don't know for sure. But I think all in my opinion is the indications are they probably were. Why do I say that? Yeah, but that's not the answer, because eunuch, again, that term can be used for a court official whether he's castrated or not. And so the question is, let's go back to 2 Kings. And I think Brother Turner has a pretty good discussion on this in his commentary. And usually for commentators that say, we're not sure that they are, they never discuss this passage. You also find this same passage in Isaiah chapter 39. But you recall that Hezekiah was sick. Good King Hezekiah, and Isaiah, at God's direction, was able to heal him, give him 15 more years of life. So look at verse 12 of 2 Kings 20. At the time, Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that Hezekiah had been sick. And Hezekiah was attentive to them and showed them all the house of his treasures, the silver and the gold, the spices, precious ointment, and all his armory, all that was found among his treasures. There was nothing in his house or in his dominion that Hezekiah did not show them. So, he gets this envoy from Babylon with a present. They appeal to Hezekiah's pride and his ego a little bit. And so Hezekiah just says, hey, let me show you what all I got. And God was kind of testing Hezekiah. And notice Isaiah the prophet comes to him in verse 14 and says, "What did these men say, and from where did they come to you?" So Hezekiah said, "They came from a far country, from Babylon." He said, "What have they seen in your house?" "Well, they've seen everything." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming, when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And they shall take some of your sons, who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Well, what did Daniel chapter 1 tell us? He says, Isaiah says, some of your very descendants, that is, seed royal, people related to the king, will be taken to Babylon and made eunuchs. And what does Daniel chapter 1 tell us? That they were, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were what? Family-wise. They were part of the kingly household, right? Of the king's seed. And here they are captured and taken to Babylonia. Now, so that prophecy comes to pass, and frankly, there's some other passages that indicate to me that, God, it wouldn't be unusual for this to happen to them, because God talks about eunuchs in the Old Testament, does He not? What does He say about them as far as their worship is concerned and entering the assembly of Jehovah? Anybody? They could not enter the assembly, right? They were not allowed to enter the assembly. But look at Isaiah chapter 56. They're not allowed to enter the assembly, but God makes provision for these eunuchs. How many times in the book of Daniel do you read about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and their wives and children, by the way? None. Look at Isaiah 56. "Keep justice and do righteousness, for my salvation is about to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who lays hold on it, who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and keeps his hand from doing any evil." Now notice. "Do not let the son of the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord has utterly separated me from His people." Who is the foreigner? Isaiah is a messianic prophet. Who is the foreigner? Who's he talking about? Gentiles. It's just Jews or Gentiles. That's all there is as far as they're concerned. If you're a foreigner, you're a Gentile. "Let not the Gentile who has joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord has utterly separated me from His people. Nor let the eunuch say, here I am, a dry tree." How does Isaiah define a eunuch? Dry tree. "For thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths and choose what pleases me, and hold fast my covenant, even to them I will give in my house and within my walls a place and a name, better than that of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." Eunuchs cannot enter the assembly of God in the Old Testament, but God says in Isaiah 56, there's a time coming, eunuch, Gentile, you'll be part of my house. You can worship in my house. You'll have an everlasting name. Keep going. "And the sons of the foreigner who join themselves to the Lord to serve Him and to love the name of the Lord, to be His servants, everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and holds fast my covenant, even them I will bring to my," what's this? "My holy mountain." Well, we've already discussed about what's the holy mountain. The church. It's the kingdom of God in the New Testament. "And make them joyful in my," now notice, house of prayer. "Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall," now notice, "my house shall be called a" what? "House of prayer for all nations." Who said that? Who said that? Jesus said that when He cleansed the temple. "My house will be a house of prayer for all nations." Jesus says, My kingdom will include everybody, whether you're a Gentile or whether you're a eunuch, because those two groups could not enter the assembly of Jehovah in the Old Testament. So I think Brother Turner makes a good point when he goes to the book of Acts, and sometimes we kind of skip over this. But Acts chapter 2, the gospel is taken to who? Jews. Acts chapter 8, Philip takes the gospel to who? Samaritans, supposedly the half-breeds. Then we skip over to Acts chapter 10, and we say Peter takes the gospel to who? Gentiles. But we leave out the rest of Acts chapter 8, in which the gospel was taken to who? A eunuch. A eunuch. God says it doesn't matter what your status was under the old covenant. When my church is established, it's not going to have anything to do with who your parents are, any physical deformities you have, none of that. You're willing to accept Christ in His appointed way and worship Him and obey Him, you're welcome in His assembly and in His kingdom. And Isaiah 56 is not talking about the Jews' temple. It's talking about the kingdom of God in the New Testament, the Messianic kingdom. So, while this is certainly not something to get in a big argument about, it just seems to me that more than likely, when it says Daniel his friends were made eunuchs, then I would think most likely they were castrated and really eunuchs. Life was tough. Which, by the way, points up to the fact that, as we discussed in our Christian Evidences study a few months back, we talked about evil, pain, and suffering. The innocent do suffer for the sins of the guilty in this life. There's no question. What did Daniel and his friends do to deserve that treatment? Well, we know from as this story goes, they're faithful. Why did they deserve such treatment? Because of the behavior of their countrymen that they received this treatment. And the innocent do suffer because of the sins of the guilty. That's the way this world is. But they're taken as political hostages. And the Babylonians were an interesting bunch. They were actually pretty smart. Proto-scientists, if you will. They studied astronomy, engineering, mathematics. One commentator says that they actually used the Pythagorean theorem before Pythagoras discovered it. John Whitcomb says that a 6th century BC Babylonian astronomer Nabu Rimanu calculated that a year was 365 days, 6 hours and 15 minutes and 41 seconds. He was only 26 minutes and 55 seconds off. In the 6th century BC. But of course, like most nations then, the Babylonians mixed their science with astrology and other superstitions. Just like the Egyptians we talked about in our Christian Evidences study. They studied astrology, onerology, the study of dreams, heptoscopy, divination by examining the liver or other organs. That's an interesting thing to me. You take an animal, you cut him open, you look at his liver, and it's supposed to tell you something. Sacrifice, incantation, exorcism, divination, and magic. They kind of mix that in with their science. They could actually predict lunar eclipses. It kind of reminds you of Moses in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, where Stephen said what? He was educated in what? No. What was Moses educated in? All the wisdom of the Egyptians, right? Well, same thing for Daniel and his friends. They were educated in all the wisdom of the Babylonians. It's interesting, too, that they used several written and spoken languages. Some of these languages had died out, but they were still using their writings, Sumerian language, the Akkadian language, which both use cuneiform. By this time, though, the main language was Aramaic, which was spoken. And so, basically, Daniel had to learn 3 written languages, and his friends, 3 new written languages, at least 1 new spoken language, and maybe more than 1 because at court they might have spoken Akkadian as well. And so he would be expected, and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, would all be expected to learn all these new languages in 3 years. And that's not uncommon. In the Roman Empire, Latin was the official language, but everybody spoke what in the first century? Koine Greek. When the Normans conquered England in 1066, the common people still spoke English, although we'd never be able to understand it. Anybody in here memorize the Canterbury Tales in high school? But at court, they spoke French, because that was the Normans' native language. So that's not unusual. So they had to learn all these languages, be able to interpret. And so, they had a lot to learn in 3 years. And so they were well educated. The Babylonians were. And Nebuchadnezzar was a man who was trying to be cultured. I mean, he wanted to be known as the greatest cultured king of his time. And he was. In fact, when we get into chapter 2 and it starts talking about these empires, he's the head of what? He's the head of gold. He was of more value than those other empires. And so, notice they're to be taught in the literature of the Chaldeans. That term is used 2 different ways in this book. Chaldea, of course, was a geographic region of southern Babylon. And so historians consider Nebuchadnezzar, and we talked about this, and his family to belong to the Chaldean dynasty. But second, that term Chaldean in this book is also used for a elite, highly educated group of scholars that practice some of these things that we talked about. And so Nebuchadnezzar gives this order to Ashpenaz. Shortly after that, he hears about the death of his father, and so he hurries home to secure the throne in Babylon. So most likely then Daniel and his friends came later. I mean, they arrived later. And keep in mind, too, that it wasn't just Daniel and his friends. Okay? There would have been other Jews. There would have been captives from other nations, young men treated the same way, given the same education. So it wasn't just those 4. But as we've already mentioned, this is the first of 3 deportations of the Jews. The last one being in 586 when the temple and the city is destroyed. Of course, Ezekiel and Jeconiah were taken in the second carrying away. So for 3 years they're going to get trained. Nebuchadnezzar is going to come off, frankly, being magnanimous. He's going to be their benefactor. He's going to take care of them. And of course, they came from nobility. He gives us their Hebrew names, but then he says what? What are they going to have to do? If you're going to fully incorporate them into your culture, what are you going to do? Yeah, you're going to have to change their names, right? And you're going to give them Babylonian names because those names, just like Hebrew names meant something, and generally meant something because of God's name, Babylonian names also generally reflected the name of their gods. For instance, Nebuchadnezzar, Nebu, the god Nebu, but his son's name was Awel Marduk, named for the god Marduk. But remember, Abram and Sarah, Sarai, Jacob, all had their names changed, didn't they? Because they meant something. I mean, names back then, a lot different than now, perhaps, actually meant something. And so he's going to change their names. Babylonian names. Also kind of reminds me of Joseph. Remember when Joseph became a ruler in Egypt, Pharaoh gave him a new name, Zaphanath-Paneah. And so we're going to fully indoctrinate them into the Babylonian culture. I get through the first 7 verses of this chapter, and basically what I see here is Daniel's pretty much passive. I mean, he's a 14, 15-year-old teenager who's been caught up in historical events way beyond his control. And then there's nothing he can do about it. But then we see him start to exert his influence and his agency in keeping with his faithfulness to the God of his fathers. And this is really, it's hard to really understand how amazing this is. These guys are 14 and 15 years old. They're carried to a far country. They are alone. They are cut off from their parents. They are cut off from the palace and where they live. They're cut off from their people. And we don't have a record of anybody else from Judah being taken captive. They might have, but standing up like this at that age to the most powerful man in the known world at that time. But Daniel, verse 8 says, purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs, perhaps the same person as the master of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, that he might not defile himself. Now notice, the New King James says God had brought. I think some of the other versions says God gave. And I told you to be looking for that phrase. God gave Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink, for why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So here's this guy, and he's he's next to the king. He's got to answer directly to the king. And Nebuchadnezzar, he's an interesting guy, and we'll talk about it some more, but he can be ruthless in one minute and compassionate the next. And he doesn't take no very well, as most kings don't. But I like what Brother Turner says about this situation. He says, human nature is essentially the same in all nations, climes, and times. Honest and upright, clean-cut teenagers are always a subject of delight and admiration. Coupled with the fact, in this instance, not only did this guy admire Daniel and his friends, but God providentially intervenes on their behalf. God gave him favor. But it's interesting, Daniel purposed in his heart. How would he defile himself? How would Daniel defile himself with the king's food? Two problems there. What are they? Well, first of all, he could be violating their dietary restrictions as set forth in the old law. They may be setting forth unclean meat in front of them, things that they were not allowed to eat. But let's suppose that's not the issue. Suppose they just set forth something that can be eaten under the old law. What's the other possible defilement? Yeah, it could have been used in worship to the pagan deities. And you recall they had that problem in the New Testament. Some Christians did, of eating things that were offered to idols. Now, some people knew, hey, that doesn't mean anything and that doesn't bother me. But some people said, that does bother me. Eastern standards, according to some historians, to share a meal was to commit oneself to friendship. It was of covenant significance. So if I'm eating this meat offered to an idol, then I'm partaking in that worship of that idol. So Daniel's got two problems. He's got one, it could be unclean. It might violate our dietary restrictions. And number two, it might have been offered to these pagan deities. So I just don't want anything to do with it. I'm just going to... It reminds me of the old illustration about, you know how sometimes some people like to see how close they can get to sin without getting burned. And we talk about the guy driving the school bus, next to the cliff, just seeing how close he can get. And Christians really ought to be of the mindset, let's just stay away as far from sin as we can. Well, that was Daniel's mindset. Look, Even if it's clean, it could have been offered to an idol. So just to avoid the whole situation, we're not going to eat it. Just give us, the King James says pulse. Most modern translations use the word vegetables. The word there that's translated actually just means something sown. So it could have actually been some kind of grain. It was either vegetables or grain, but it wasn't meat. He said, just give us this, and we'll drink water, and we'll be fine. And that guy says, no, I like you, but I like my head better. So I can't go along with that. But that doesn't stop Daniel because Daniel has purposed in his heart. So we'll talk about his next move. Sometimes instead of going up the food chain when you want something done, it's better to do what? Go down the food chain. You go down to somebody whose head's not in jeopardy. That's what he does in this case. All right, so we'll pick up there next week.